The forbidden ritual that led to a nightmare. True story from the Philippines. The sun was setting over the dense jungles of the Philippines, painting the sky in hues of blood red and orange as the clouds seemed to merge with the creeping mists of the land below. Deep in the forest, where the canopy grew thick and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth, a group of 5 friends, Joaquin, Mark, Carla, Liza, and Rena, had just reached the edge of a forgotten village. None of them had been prepared for what lay ahead, and none of them would survive to tell the tale. Joaquin had always been the adventurous one, the leader of their small group, a man whose curiosity had led him to many places that most would avoid. The group of friends had been drawn to the Philippines by an ancient legend, one that had been passed down through generations in whispers and rumors. It spoke of a forgotten ritual, a curse that had plagued the land for centuries, and a temple buried deep within the jungle that had been abandoned by time itself. The more Joaquin heard, the more he became obsessed with uncovering its truth. The others, hesitant at first, had finally agreed to join him, driven by curiosity and a thirst for adventure. None of them could have predicted what would happen that night. They had come looking for a story, for a thrill, but what they found was something far worse. The village, abandoned for decades, was eerily quiet. Its wooden huts, long since weathered by the unforgiving elements, seemed to lean inwards as if to hide from the jungle that surrounded them. The ground beneath their feet was soft and spongy, as if the earth itself was absorbing the sins of those who had once lived here. The air was thick, damp, and smelled of decay. The only sound was the distant chirping of cicadas, an eerie melody that seemed to mock their intrusion. They walked deeper into the village, with Joaquin leading the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every step they took seemed to echo through the stillness, as if the jungle was holding its breath, waiting. It was Mark, the skeptic of the group, who first spoke up. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice tinged with irritation. "There's nothing here. This is just an abandoned village. No ghosts, no demons, just decay." But Joaquin, as usual, was undeterred. "You never know what's waiting to be discovered," he said, his voice filled with an eager excitement. "This place is cursed. There's a story behind it, a real one. We're going to find it." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them had the heart to turn back now. They had come too far, and the thrill of the unknown was enough to keep them moving forward. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the village that they saw it, the temple. Standing at the heart of the jungle, the temple was barely visible through the dense undergrowth, its stone walls long overtaken by vines and moss. There were no windows, no doors, just an imposing stone structure that seemed to emanate an energy all its own. It was like something out of a nightmare, a place where the light itself dared not enter. Joaquin grinned, his heart racing with excitement. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where the ritual was performed. This is where it all began." The others stared at the temple, their faces pale, but there was no turning back now. They stepped forward, their feet crunching on the dry earth, and made their way toward the entrance. But as they approached, a strange feeling began to settle in the air. It was a subtle shift at first, a feeling of unease that none of them could place. Then, as they crossed the threshold of the temple, the temperature seemed to drop. A cold wind whipped through the open stone walls, and the once still air began to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. "Do you feel that?" Rena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It's like something's watching us." Joaquin shrugged, trying to mask his own unease. "It's nothing. Just your imagination." But as they stepped further inside, the air grew heavier, thicker, like the weight of centuries was pressing down on them. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols that none of them could understand, their edges worn by time but still very much alive with something ancient. The altar at the center of the room was cracked, but there was something about it that caught their attention, something unsettling. It was as though the altar had been used recently, though it was clear that this temple had been abandoned for years. "Do you think they really performed the ritual here?" Carla asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course they did," Joaquin said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The stories say this is where they summoned the spirit, where the curse was bound." But Mark, ever the skeptic, wasn't convinced. "You can't seriously believe in that, Joaquin. It's just a myth." "Maybe," Joaquin replied, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "But I have to know. I have to see it for myself." Without warning, he reached forward and touched the altar. The moment his fingers brushed the cold stone, the room seemed to change. The vibrations in the air intensified, a deep, guttural hum that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The temperature dropped further, and the once faint glow from the cracks in the stone altar flared to life. A cold, blue light filled the room, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. For a moment, everything went still. The air seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire world was waiting for something. Then, the whispering began. It started as a low murmur, so faint that they could barely hear it. But as they strained to listen, the voices grew louder, disembodied whispers, indistinct, like a chorus of people speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, and a deep sense of dread settled in their bones. "What the hell is that?" Liza asked, her voice cracking with fear. "I don't know," Joaquin said, his excitement now replaced with a creeping sense of dread. "But we need to leave. Now." They turned to leave, but the doorway was gone. The once clear path had vanished, replaced by a dense fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, thick and suffocating. The jungle outside had disappeared, and they were trapped in the temple, surrounded by the murmur of unseen voices. Then, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The walls trembled, and the floor cracked open, revealing a dark, abyssal pit below. From the depths of the pit, something began to rise. It was as if the temple itself was alive, its ancient bones awakening after centuries of slumber. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the very air seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Joaquin's heart raced as the entity, something far older than any of them could comprehend, began to materialize in the shadows. It was not human, nor was it any beast known to man. It was a thing of darkness, with glowing eyes and tendrils of shadow that writhed like living smoke. The creature, or whatever it was, began to move toward them, its form shifting and flickering, as if it were made of nothing but nightmares. In that moment, they understood. The ritual had never been completed. The curse had never been broken. And they were now part of it. As the creature lunged forward, a scream echoed through the temple, a scream that would never be heard by the living. And in that moment, the jungle outside remained still, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of the nightmare to unfold. And so, the story of the cursed temple was sealed once more. The forbidden ritual had led to a nightmare, one that would continue to claim those foolish enough to disturb its slumber. The temple was waiting, its hunger unquenchable, its whispers endless. They froze, caught in a suffocating silence as the whispering grew louder, wrapping around them like a dark, invisible fog. Every breath felt heavy, as though the air itself was thick with dread, pressing down on their chests. The atmosphere inside the temple had shifted entirely. The once familiar walls now felt foreign and alive. A malevolent presence hung in the air, palpable and suffocating, sending icy tendrils of terror deep into their spines. The ground trembled beneath their feet, just a slight quiver at first, but it quickly escalated to a violent shaking. The stone beneath them cracked, deep fissures opening up along the floor like jagged scars on the temple's surface. Mark, who had always considered himself the skeptic, was now wide-eyed, his face pale, his breathing shallow. "What the hell is happening?" he gasped, clutching his chest as if he could somehow stop the panic rising inside him. Liza stumbled back, bumping into one of the temple's crumbling stone columns. "We need to get out, now," she screamed, her voice cracking with raw fear. But before anyone could make a move, the air shifted again. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the room, so low that it seemed to come from the very ground itself. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't even human. It was something far worse, a dark, ancient thing that had slumbered beneath the earth for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The altar, once merely a cracked stone slab at the center of the room, began to glow. The eerie blue light that had faintly flickered before now pulsed, growing stronger with each passing second. The light distorted the shadows in the room, stretching them out unnaturally, as though the darkness itself was alive, reaching for them. Joaquin, his heart pounding in his chest, stared at the altar, transfixed. His curiosity, once a driving force, now felt like a curse. What's happening?" Rena's voice trembled as she turned to Joaquin, her wide eyes reflecting the light from the altar. "What did we do? What is this thing?" Joaquin opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The whispers in the room had escalated to a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once in a language none of them could comprehend. The walls seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, and the ground beneath them seemed to move, as if the temple itself was alive, breathing, responding to their presence. Suddenly, from the altar, a shadow began to emerge. At first, it was just a silhouette, a tall, towering figure, with limbs that stretched far beyond any human proportions. But as it moved toward them, the shadows seemed to bleed from the stone, pulling onto the floor, creeping toward the group. The creature was not entirely solid, it flickered like a shadow, yet it was so real, so tangible, that every part of it sent waves of terror through their bodies. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed a sickly yellow, like the light of a dying star, casting an unholy gleam on the walls. The air grew colder, unbearably cold, and they could see their own breath fogging in front of their faces. Joaquin's skin crawled as a dark, rancid stench filled the air, the smell of rot and decay so overpowering that it made his stomach turn. His hands shook as he grabbed for his flashlight, but the light flickered and died. He could hear the others panicking around him, but his mind was fixated on the figure before him, the creature that was now standing in the center of the room, inches from them. What do you want from us?" Carla cried, her voice trembling, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. She was trying to make sense of the scene before her, but nothing made sense. Everything felt wrong. The Shadow Man's form shifted, and with a horrid screech, it lunged toward them, its long, gnarled fingers reaching for their throats. The room shook violently as the thing's arms stretched impossibly long, closing in on them. Time slowed. Each second felt like an eternity as they tried to run, but the room seemed to stretch and warp around them, as though the very space was conspiring to keep them trapped. Joaquin was the first to react, his legs moving before his brain could process what was happening. He grabbed Carla's arm, yanking her toward the door, but it was too late. The entrance that had been there moments before was gone. In its place, an impenetrable wall of shadow and mist had appeared, swallowing the doorway whole. Panic set in as they all scrambled in different directions, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls as they tried to find a way out, but every corner, every passage, led only to more darkness. "Help me!" Liza screamed, her voice high-pitched and desperate, but the sound was swallowed by the unearthly growls of the creature. It was drawing closer, its long arms slithering over the ground, stretching towards them like tendrils of darkness reaching for their souls. The temple itself seemed to be collapsing around them. The floor cracked open beneath them, and the ceiling above them groaned, as if the weight of the curse that had been bound there for centuries was finally too much to bear. The creature continued to grow, its form now fully materialized, towering over them like a nightmare-given flash. It had no face, no recognizable features, just an endless void that sucked in all light and sound. Joaquin's heart pounded in his chest as he turned, running blindly through the fog that now engulfed the room. He collided with Mark, who was stumbling back, wide-eyed and gasping for air. "What do we do? What do we do?" Mark shouted, his voice a mix of disbelief and sheer terror. "I don't know," Joaquin screamed back, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. They were going to die here. They were going to be consumed by whatever this thing was. The ground beneath their feet cracked open further, and a cold wind began to swirl around them, pulling them toward the center of the room. The altar at the heart of the temple was now glowing fiercely, as if calling them, beckoning them to come closer, to finish what had been started centuries ago. "No!" Rena screamed, her voice raw, her body shaking uncontrollably. "We need to get out. We need to get out now." But it was too late. The Shadow Man reached out with one of its tendrils, wrapping it around Rena's ankle and pulling her towards the altar. She screamed in terror as she tried to break free, her hands clawing at the stone floor, but it was no use. The creature's grip was unrelenting. "Rena!" Carla cried, rushing forward, but Joaquin grabbed her arm, holding her back. He could see it now. The altar was where the ritual had been performed. It was where the curse had been sealed, and now it was awake. The dark energy that had been contained for so long was now free, and it was consuming everything in its path. "No, no, and no!" Liza screamed, running towards Rena, but she was too far away. The Shadow Man dragged Rena closer to the altar, its form flickering and distorting as it absorbed her. Rena's cries were cut short as she was swallowed by the darkness. Joaquin felt his heart freeze in his chest. It was as if the temple itself had become a living, breathing entity, feeding on their fear, drawing them in. Every step they took only seemed to pull them deeper into its grasp. The whispers grew louder, their words now clearer, though still incomprehensible. They were being surrounded, suffocated, and in that moment, Joaquin realized what they had stumbled upon, an ancient evil, bound to this place, waiting for the right moment to rise again. They had unleashed it. They had broken the seal. Joaquin turned to the others, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. We can't stop it. We're trapped. It's too late." And as the Shadow Man loomed over them, stretching its tendrils towards the remaining survivors, the temple itself seemed to come alive, its walls closing in on them. The final whispers of the ritual filled their ears, as the darkness swallowed them whole, their screams echoing through the forgotten halls. In that moment, they knew they had made a terrible mistake. They had disturbed something that should have been left alone. And now, there was no escape from the nightmare they had unleashed. The temple had claimed them, and with it, the curse would continue. The darkness closed in on them faster than they could comprehend. The shadows twisted and stretched, their forms becoming more grotesque with every passing second, bending and warping like something out of a nightmare. They were suffocating in it, drowning in an oppressive wave of fear that made it impossible to breathe, impossible to think. Their bodies seemed to freeze in place, as if the very air had turned to stone. Joaquin's heart hammered in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears, but the screams of his friends were louder. Liza had collapsed to the ground, her hands clawing at the stone floor, desperately trying to hold on to something solid, something real. But nothing was solid here. Nothing was real. The walls, the altar, the floor beneath their feet, all of it had begun to melt away, as though the temple itself was dissolving, consumed by the same darkness that had risen from the pit. It was the smell that hit them first, rotting flesh, something fetid and decayed. It burned in their nostrils, thick and suffocating, as if the very essence of death had been released into the room. The stench of it was overpowering, enough to make their stomachs turn and their eyes water, but it wasn't the smell that terrified them the most. No, it was the feeling that something was watching them. Something waiting. Something that hungered. It was then that the walls began to pulse. At first, it was subtle, just a faint vibration, but soon the entire room was alive with movement. The stone walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some ancient beast. The floor beneath their feet felt soft now, like they were walking on some living organism, not solid ground at all. Joaquin's feet sank into it with every step, as if the temple itself was pulling him down, trying to drag him under. But it was real. Joaquin could feel it in his bones. The temple had come alive, and they were its prey. They were trapped in its grip, caught in the curse that had been waiting for centuries, and there was no way out. No way to escape the nightmare that was consuming them, piece by piece. The shadows began to move again, swirling in the corners of the room, crawling up the walls like insects. They seemed to gather in the center, forming into shapes, twisting, contorting into something neither human nor animal. It was a mass of darkness, a formless nightmare that seemed to pulse with an unholy rhythm. And then, as if drawn by some unseen force, the shadows began to merge, coalescing into the figure they had seen earlier. The Shadow Man. It was no longer just a silhouette. No longer just a flickering, shapeless thing. It was now standing before them, fully formed, its towering presence casting a dark, oppressive shadow that seemed to consume everything in its path. Its eyes were like twin pools of liquid fire, glowing with an unnatural light. Its face was a blank, formless void, and the black tendrils that hung from its limbs seemed to writhe and twitch like snakes, ready to strike. Joaquin's legs went weak beneath him. He could barely breathe, let alone think. The thing before him was beyond any nightmare he had ever imagined. It wasn't something they could run from. It wasn't something they could fight. It was something ancient, something powerful beyond comprehension. And they had awakened it. The thing stretched out one of its arms, its tendrils twisting around the air like serpents. It reached for Mark first, the longest, most twisted of its tendrils extending toward him. Mark gasped, his eyes wide with terror, but before he could even move, the tendril wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. He struggled, his hands clawing at the air, his legs kicking in a futile attempt to break free, but it was no use. The creature's grip was like iron, unyielding, suffocating. "No! No!" Carla screamed, running toward him, but she was too slow. Joaquin tried to reach for Mark, but it was pointless. The Shadow Man's grip was too strong. Slowly, as though savoring the moment, the creature lifted Mark higher, his body convulsing as the life drained from him. His eyes bulged, his face turning purple as he gasped for breath, but the Shadow Man showed no mercy. It held him in its grasp, tightening its hold until there was nothing left but a limp, lifeless body. Joaquin could only watch in horror as Mark's body was released, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. There was no time to mourn. No time to process. Because the Shadow Man was moving again. It turned its attention to Liza and Carla, its tendrils flicking like whips as it loomed over them. Liza backed away, her hands trembling, her body shaking with terror. But it was too late. The tendrils shot out, faster than they could react, and wrapped around Liza's body. She screamed, her voice piercing the air, but the creature didn't care. With a sharp, sickening crack, Liza's body was lifted off the ground, her limbs flailing helplessly, her eyes wide with terror. Joaquin couldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear, his body frozen in place, watching as the thing devoured his friends, one by one. Carla screamed again, but it was too late for her, too. The creature turned its tendrils toward her, and in a single, swift motion, it struck. The last thing Joaquin saw before everything went black was Carla's face, her eyes wide in terror, her mouth open in a final scream that was cut short by the shadow's grip. And then, nothing. Everything went silent. The room, once filled with the sounds of their screams and the creature's growls, was now eerily quiet. The darkness had swallowed everything, and Joaquin was left alone in the center of the temple, surrounded by the bodies of his friends. The Shadow Man was gone. The temple was still. But Joaquin knew it wasn't over. He could still feel the eyes on him. He could feel the presence lurking just beyond his reach, waiting for the right moment. He could feel the curse, the ritual, the dark energy that had been awakened, and it was calling to him. The whispers had returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. He could hear them now, in his ears, in his mind. The ancient voices, the lost souls trapped within the walls of the temple, were whispering to him, urging him to join them, to give in to the darkness. Joaquin's vision blurred, his senses clouded with fear and exhaustion. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching for the walls to steady himself. But the temple was no longer solid. It was alive, shifting around him like a living organism, its walls folding in on themselves, closing him in. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, and he knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The curse had claimed him, just as it had claimed his friends. The ritual had been completed. The temple was no longer a forgotten ruin, it was a living entity, hungry for souls, feeding on the fear of those foolish enough to disturb its slumber. And now, Joaquin was one of them. He had become part of the nightmare, a part of the curse. And he would never leave. The temple would claim him, just as it had claimed so many others before him.